Leander, it's Andrew Naudine back in the studio here at Lantern Media Studios for the latest episode of Lean in Leander. And with me today is a gentleman I met it's probably been about a month, maybe a month and a half ago. I can't remember where were we when we met. We were at the
lunch and learn.
It was a lunch and learn, I think. Yeah, I think you're right. Anyway, this is Chuck Clayton. Not the Chuck Clayton, the long-standing character from Archie Comics. That's not him. But he wrote a book. He's actually written several books. And the one that caught my attention is called Mastering Critical Thinking. So, Chuck, welcome to the podcast. I appreciate you coming in. I'm very excited about this one. This is one that I've been looking forward to. So let's start with a bit of a precursor, right? Help my audience understand, like where you started. I think you've written a couple of books on like poker and stuff like that. So what was it that got you to think, you know what, I need to write a book about critical thinking? How did you get there?
That's a great question. Back when I went to Pepperdine University, I had a professor named Dr. Wayne Gertmanian. We used to call him lovingly Dr. G.
Okay.
And during class, he taught microeconomics. But during that class, he taught microeconomics, macroeconomics, spiced it with religion, law, and investing. It was one of the most incredible classes I've ever had in my lifetime.
That's an interesting mix of stuff. I'd call that a gumbo class, right?
I figured if I had 12 classes with professors like that, there wasn't a job on the earth that you couldn't do.
Right. That's always nice.
If you ever saw the movie with Kingsfield in it, Paper Chase.
Oh, yeah.
He kind of reminded me a little bit of that. I always hoped that someday I would have a professor like that, and I did.
Cool.
But during the class, he would do certain things. Like, for example, he would get to the audience, or the class people, and he would say, you can have an ounce of gold or an ounce of goods and services. And people would gather up in one side of the room or the other, depending upon what they chose.
Okay.
And then he would ask the question, what are you going to do with the gold? And the person would say, well, I'm going to buy goods and services. No, you got the gold. And what he was doing was making a point, is some of the richest societies are the ones that have goods and services and are able to, human capital, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it got you thinking. So that was my introduction to critical thinking. In 2007, I wrote a book. It sold a couple thousand copies, and it was called A Guide to the Lost Art of Critical Thinking.
Okay.
And it did well, but then it went away. And then it was several years ago, I kept getting contacted by people, especially being in the publishing and having several books published. And people kept saying they wanted to republish it, which I knew I wasn't going to do. And in 15 years or so, or a little more than that, I'd grown a lot. So I started thinking about it, and one thing led to another, and there's the book,
So this is it fair to say this is a reimagination of your original book on critical thinking, or is this just a more mature take on the same subject?
I would say a more mature take dramatically. If someone who didn't know me would have read the two books, it's more like looking, and not that I'm a kid or anything, but somebody who wrote a book at like 22 and then 15 to 18 years later writes another book.
Right.
It is so much more in depth. It has so much more. I studied my tail off to try to do justice to the subject, because practical critical thinking is so important in everybody's lives, all of us. And if we use it properly, we can have a much better life.
Right. So this book, if I have my information correct, and I'm gonna use my notes, okay? Because I like to try to use critical thinking while I'm having these podcasts. But since this is specifically on the subject of critical thinking, I thought, okay, let's break this down. So the book itself is structured 4 main sections, okay? And those are the foundational critical thinking skills.
Correct.
Right? Then you go into mastering critical thinking, and then critical thinking applications. And the one that I like the most, the one that caught my attention was becoming a new breed of critical thinker, right? So
Yes.
I thought that was a very interesting way to kind of introduce that, right? And admittedly, I haven't read the book in its entirety. I've read some summaries of the book, right? But I haven't read it in its entirety, which I'm hoping to do here.
This is going to be your
Thank
copy.
you very much. I was hoping that might be for me. What I want to kind of delve into is let's talk a little bit about like the critical thinking itself, right? And then I'd like to maybe kind of bring that around to where we can take some real world examples of where you could take a subject and we can come up with something, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
And kind of walk people through a process of critical thinking. Like, how would you approach this subject if you're trying to think critically? So I wanted to start here. You titled the book "Mastering Critical Thinking: Learn How to Think, Not What to Think," which I think is an important distinction, right?
Yes.
So, what inspired you to focus on this distinction between how and what we think?
There is so much misinformation in the news, in the politics, in so much that's out there. How do you cut through the chafe and figure out what the facts and data are?
Mm-hmm.
Is global warming or climate change, is it real? Is affirmative action a good thing? Is the space program, did it accomplish what it was set out to do? When we start asking these questions, as a critical thinker, we use certain things. Well, anybody can do critical thinking if you have a willingness to do it.
Right.
And the first absolute positive thing that has to be done is to have a curious and open mind.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds incredibly simple,
mm-hmm.
incredibly difficult for a lot of people.
Oh, yeah.
I watch so many people and they go, oh, yeah, I'm open and curious. But then you give them facts and data
right.
that are irrefutable.
Right.
And they still stick, I know, but.
Right.
It's like,
right.
Okay, so some people, if you truly have an open mind, then you look at both sides, you weigh the facts, you weigh the data, you understand things. And we're going to get into this later, but ways of learning is reading from people who really understand how to critically think. Well, my favorite author has to be Thomas Sowell.
Okay.
And I discovered him years ago when we had the riots.
Okay.
A niece called me on the phone and said, what's going on? And I gave a really lame answer, and I was upset with myself. And I went to my office, and in there was a book called Basic Economics by a guy named Thomas Sowell. I still don't know how it got in my office because it's a 500-page book. I read the thing.
A paperweight, maybe?
I read it from cover to cover. But Thomas Sowell, and a lot of people have heard about him, but he's written somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 books. I've actually read over 24 of his books. But he talks about history, economics, culture, race relations, and more. And I've learned so much, but he respects the reader's intelligence. Or if you're watching him on video, you can find many videos. And I say, if you want to learn about him, I don't even have to tell you which video to go to. There's so many over the last 50 years that you can go to and learn from him.
Mm-hmm.
Patrick Bet-Davis, I heard recently, who's a well-known podcaster, came out and said he recommended everybody, I thought this was interesting, is to spend 40 hours watching Thomas Sowell. Because a lot of people aren't going to read the books.
Right.
I've spent hundreds of hours reading the books, but that's me. I just, the more I learned, the more I understood, and the more I realized what was going on, why it's going on, what can I do about it, and so forth. And what I've done is partially is writing the book, to try to help people to be able to think through things.
With as much misinformation as out there. I recently had an opportunity. I was introduced to forget the name of the individual, but they are the cybersecurity guru, if you will, in the country of Taiwan, right? And the country of Taiwan has taken a very, very different approach to social media and information available on social media than what the United States has. It's actually, I would say, and again, these are my words, not theirs, but I would say almost the opposite, because here in our environments, in our social media environments, the algorithms are attuned to amplify negative commentary. That they're intended to get your attention, and the purveyors of social media have found over time, obviously with this incredibly diverse and large melting pot to be able to test things on, right? Which is basically what they do. They do A/B testing in real time. Is that they found that the positive reinforcement does not get them as much attention as the negative reinforcement does. So the negative stories or the negative connotation on stories tends to get people's attention a little bit better. It's stickier, right?
Correct.
And it gets people like it'll elicit the type of reaction that they're looking for. They want that type of feedback because they want you to be engaged in that particular area. Now in Taiwan, what they do, and this is shorthand, I might be misstating a little bit here, so don't fact check me 100% on this. In Taiwan, what they do is if they see something that they believe is in error, or I won't go as far as saying malicious, but if they look at it and they qualify it as misinformation. So in Taiwan, what they do is they actually say, hey, this thing over here that this person is saying, it's misinformation. It's not correct. They point it out, and then they amplify that. So by the time an individual who might be less engaged gets to that particular piece of information, they've already heard that it's not correct. They've heard prior to that now this is actually not factually correct, or this is misleading at the very least, right? There's a little bit of that going on now because there's like the community forum type approach to social media in the United States. And I think there's some positives to that. But again, the infrastructure there is so fractured that if you're not on a social media that is taking that type of approach, you're only going to see what it is that they're amplifying, right? So you can look at it from the perspective of like X now, and how X manages commentary and feedback, and comparative to, I don't know, Instagram or perhaps even Blue Sky. Those are they're all subject to their own environments. And unfortunately, I think the drawback there is that it become a little bit of an echo chamber, right? You don't really get the full picture. And in order for you, and I hate this because this is something that I think is really counterproductive, in order for you to get a full picture of what's going on, you have to take in many, many, many sources, right? And I think that's kind of what I took away from you, is that instead of what to think, it was how to think, right? And I would say, hey, if you really want to be critical if you want to apply critical thinking now, you should probably take in multiple sources of information, right, to help you make some determinations on what is actually factual and to a degree true, right? Truth is a perspective. It depends on your, where you're coming from, and you're going to have a different flavor of the truth, but the truth itself is always going to be true, right? I think that's a fair way to say that.
Yes.
So, how did your years of experience, like again, you'd written a book as a younger man about critical thinking, and then now all this stuff happens, and you learn, and you get this wonderful mentor of sorts, and you rethink things, right? I mean, isn't that in itself an example of critical thinking?
Yes, I believe so. I have found many mentors over time, but that's one of the things: is find the sources that you know to be true, that are consistent across different areas. When Thomas Sowell, like I said, Victor Davis Hanson is another one, historian. I read an incredible book on him. I've read a few books from him, and there's other people too that over time, you fact check them and you find out they're correct over and over and over again. So then they become a source.
Mm-hmm.
And then I start trusting what they say rather than somebody else. A guy named Mark Dice, who's a popular, if you want to call podcaster, a YouTuber,
Mm-hmm.
He has a book out called The True Story of Fake News. Really an eye-opening book.
Mm-hmm.
And shows these facts. And the ones that I like in the books, and Thomas Sowell is great at this, is there's all these notations at the back of the book of where it is. So you
Right.
can go back
Right.
and research yourself. And I
Right.
try to do the same thing with my book,
Right.
is you can go back and look at the source that I found. Now you can argue, yes, but you've got this and that, and I've seen these arguments, they can degenerate into something. But at some point you have to make your own decisions on there. And that's what I really like about Thomas Sowell. It's his favorite book that I liked. Which at first it's almost a little bit on the intellectual side. It's not as easy to read as his other ones,
Mm-hmm.
but it's called A Conflict of Visions. And it inspired me to write 4 chapters at the end of my book calling Conflicting Visions. And he talks about that these visions have always been there and what they mean for us.
So when he's speaking of visions, I mean, is that literally is that the literal term itself, like the visions that people have, or is he more using that in the context of, when you're informing yourself, you develop a vision of a particular subject
He's talking
matter?
about groups, okay?
Okay.
The one is called the unconstrained vision, and then the other one's a constrained vision. Think of the constrained vision like the United States.
Okay.
Nothing's perfect, but you have the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the rule of law, separation of power, all these different things, from not just the legislature to the judicial and executive office, but the states, local, and everything else. And so you have all this checks and balances and things.
Mm-hmm.
And the other vision is more, if you put the right people and the right systems in place, that things will work out. And it leans towards centralized control. And we found out over millennia how this works out. It used to be the kings and things like that. Last century, it got into the socialist societies of Stalin and Lenin and Stalin and Hitler and Pol Pot and Mao Zedong and
Mm-hmm.
these other people, where they tried to do centralized control and everything, and we saw over 100 million deaths last century. We live in a very unique time. We're relatively very calm.
Right.
In comparison to
No.
when you look back through history, it's incredibly violent.
Right. Right. I've said that several times to people in context of intellectual conversation, right?
Yes.
To where, if you look at it post World War II, yes, there have been violent incidents, right? But comparatively, historically, much, much, much less than what had ever occurred before. And you can say that's a post-atomic reality, right? The post-atomic reality is that there's a realization that, and you hope that it holds from an intellectual exercise, that there's a realization that, like, okay, we can destroy ourselves if we're not careful. So it kind of keeps us away from that edge, right? And I mean, even today when we're recording the podcast, just last night, in India retaliated against Pakistan, whereas there were rebels, I think I should call them, probably in the Kurdistan, I believe is the area near Pakistan, that were responsible for some attacks on Indian. I think it was a city, or I can't remember exactly what the outline of that is, but it was not necessarily Pakistani attack on India. It was more of a group or a sect within the Kurdistan or Pakistan area that attacked India, but India retaliated against Pakistan, and now Pakistan has said that is an act of war, right? So now you're like, okay, both of you guys are nuclear, you have nuclear capacity. Now what, right? Like, now what? You have to try to de-escalate that, and fortunately for us, and at least in my lifetime, that has been the case. Like, we've been able to de-escalate to a degree on most, if not actually all of these conflicts, because we've never seen another nuclear,
and hopefully,
and hopefully never will, right? Right.
I mean, because things could change tomorrow. But
Oh,
yes,
yeah, no,
I
absolutely.
agree with you. It's not like it couldn't get worse than it was before.
Right. It actually get much, much worse than it was before, but it's been relatively good
Right.
in the last, half
60
century.
years,
right.
yes,
Yeah.
agreed.
So the last
Okay.
half century. So, So how do you segue from possible nuclear war? Like, where do we go from here? All right, so
let's talk about more fun subjects.
But I really appreciate you kind of helping like my audience, like just kind of walk and these are literal examples of critical thinking, right?
Yes.
We're just kind of going through this process where we're kind of, all right, these are the things, and it is how to think. It's not necessarily what to think. We don't necessarily need to, and I think that this is where I was going originally. I remember my original thought. When you are when you're doing a critical exercise, an exercise in critical thinking, when you're doing that, you don't necessarily need to come up with an answer, right? It's just going through the process.
Well, it's how you think about something. You know, human-caused climate change. I want to be careful, but what I did was to study for 10 or 12 pages. I read a few different books on the subject that I felt, were highly rated, had some good, and on a couple of different ways of looking at it and so forth. And then reading articles and getting data and resource and things like this. And it opens your eyes to how you feel about it. Do we need to take care of the planet? Of course. But are we doing it in the right ways?
Right.
Is a question.
Right.
Okay, and that's what my conclusion is.
Right, but it's just the question, right? It's not necessarily an answer to the question. You're asking, are we doing it in the right ways? And at least at that point...
Right, and I give suggestions.
Okay, but at that point, you're just prompting the reader. And don't let me again, please. I haven't read the book in its entirety, but I at that point, I got the impression that you're prompting the reader to take the next step in a way. Like, just think about this, right? Just think about this for a second. Right? You're not necessarily giving them an answer.
Have you seen the TV series Landman?
You know what? It's been recommended to me by quite a few people, and I have yet to look at to watch them. That's Billy Bob Thornton, right?
And I just watched the first episode last night, but I've seen one of the things that I really enjoyed was one of them where he's talking about the windmills.
Okay.
And that's the right term. And he explains that all the energy putting into, and I actually have, not from watching that TV series, but I have it in my book about the wind turbines and everything else. And if you're going to look at something as an engineer, see, my background's engineering. That's another thing that drove me to critical thinking, because I worked on satellites, I've worked on ground support equipment for the space shuttle, I've worked on computers. I've done all sorts of different types of things, but you better be a critical thinker, and you better be able to listen to the facts and data and empirical evidence to really understand. But when you look at these wind turbines and things like this, you ask the simple question, cradle to grave, what's it cost? You build these incredible monolith type things. They can cause harm to the bird population, things. That's just one thing. But how much oil does it take to manufacture these things? How much oil does it take to run it? How long are their useful lives? How much energy are they generating over the 20 years that they're good? Once you have to get rid of them, and you put them in landfills and things like this. And when you start asking those questions, that's what I do in the book, is I ask the questions. I'm not saying I totally have the answer, but it's very questionable whether they're really helping us.
And I'm glad that's a great segue, because that's part of, people get the wrong impression, I think, and I'm not going to say all people, that's too much of a blanket statement, right? That's too blanket of a statement, but I think there's a lot of people that when you start discussing the idea of critical thinking, they take almost... It creates a posture of defense, like a defensive posture in a lot of people. They'll get kind of defensive about it. Well, what do you mean critical thinking? Are you saying I'm not smart? Are you not saying that I'm not thinking things through, right? And that can be a little bit difficult to overcome. So this is the segue. You explore decision making with imperfect information in the book, right? You talk about that, right? And so I want to kind of turn that and say, okay, so if you're listening to this podcast or if you're watching, how would someone doing that, watching, listening, how do they apply that concept in, fast-moving, high-stakes environments like business, or decision-making in a political landscape? How do you do that? Like, that's a lot. You have to be able to, I think, if you're dealing with imperfect information, you should be able to determine the imperfect part, right? Am I wrong?
No, that's correct. I have a close friend of mine. I just talked to him recently. And he suggested that I put in human nature, which I do in the book, because human nature has a big component of this. I mean,
Right.
You can come up with the most perfect idea. For example, let's talk about global, climate change, right?
Right, right,
Why not? What are the lungs of the planet? The forest, right?
right.
Now, I'm an engineer, but I'm not crazy about the ones that can strip down forests, and just cut out all the trees super fast and everything else. Why not work a way so the forests aren't cut down? Now, maybe we pay somebody, you could call it ransom, whatever. But is that a smart, would that help us? Those are the lungs of the, greenery is the lungs of our planet.
Right.
And it has increased, but we can tear it down and we can cause major problems. Why not look at that, okay, as a way of helping our environment? Another one is fishing areas. You get these incredible areas of fishing. And if you take certain places and you say you can't fish in here, and make the punishment so severe that they can't, but fish will proliferate, and then they'll spawn off, come off, and they'll go into all these other areas, and then people can fish in those areas, and you can just generate this using nature in the proper ways. And we're not doing that. And why is that? Partially because it's not politically smart for a lot of people,
right?
Because keeping problems in place is the way politicians stay in power, and that's a big problem.
I would tend to agree with you. I would tend to agree with you because if you remove, you're right. In my opinion, you're correct. I mean, if you do solve some of the problems that are generating the focus that you have, or that you're able to leverage for power, or however you want to frame that. It's unfortunate. I think it's an unfortunate reality of where we live today, because I think I would like to think that at some point in time, most of the decisions that were being made were in some way or another aimed at resolving problems, right? But when you start to look at it, right? When you start to look at it, I think you find the opposite. I think you find the opposite, that many times that the decisions that are being made are stopping short of solving a problem, because the problem itself is something that is profitable. Again, it can lead to a continuation of a power situation.
Yes.
Right. I mean,
well, when you say profitable to who? For politicians, where do they get their power? They get their power from saying that they're going to see solving problems. And a lot of times, they're just proliferating and keeping the problem going. And so forth. Thomas Sowell has one of many profound things he has in there is ask the question on any policy or procedure or program or whatever, compared to what, at what cost, and what are the hard facts. And if you start doing that, you're going to find some really interesting things.
Oh yeah, no.
Affirmative action was all about equality, okay, and then it morphed into something else.
No, and I think that's a very good point. I think that the intention, and many times when I've had these kind of conversations, again, I always try to go back to what was the original intent? What was it that you were trying to solve? What was the problem that was presenting itself, and how are you trying to solve it? Now, I've learned in the last 5-6 years about, and can understand it in a much more tangible way, is the baked in bias that comes into play when problem solving is the intent. So I'll give you an example. In the area that I work, my employment, right? One of the intents is to ensure that the sales agents are following a specific pattern, I'm in the telecom industry, so it's a call flow, right? You want your sales agents to do things in a certain order and with certain direction and intent, right? And that's great, right? But there's a bias there that all of the agents will be able to sell as well as follow the call flow. It's a bias, it's built in. Right? They think that, okay, hey, this call flow will gain us more sales. And I've always argued, no, because they don't know how to sell. They know how to follow a call flow. That's fine, but you're not teaching them any kind of sales methodology here. They're not really learning how to sell. They're learning how to parrot. They're learning how to follow a script. And it's going to work a certain amount of the time, right? It's going to work just because numbers, right? You're just going to have certain people that are going to be affected by that particular script and say, oh yeah, hey, that sounds like the best thing. Let me go ahead and take that from you, and boom, there's a sale, right? But that's, a broken clock is right twice a day kind of thing, right? So when you look at that and you're trying to figure out, and you go into this in the book as well, is that I think you refer to it as the importance of multiple intelligences.
Yes.
And self-awareness, right?
Yes.
I thoroughly enjoyed my conversation with Chuck Clayton, and we went really long on this particular podcast. So for the video versions, I'm splitting it in 2 sections. So this will be episode 71 and 72. So tune in for episode 72, and you'll get the rest of the episode. You can also hear the episode in its entirety on all of the audio channels, Apple and Spotify and all of the other audio podcasting channels. So appreciate your time, and like I said, jump on here in the video areas to catch the next episode. Lean In Leander was recorded at Lantern Media Studio. Engineered by Morgan Tuttle. Produced and edited by Andrew Naughty. Music provided by Ben Sam.